we tend to believe that the corporation is a modern invention. We look at the glass towers of Wall Street, the high-frequency trading algorithms, and the global banking networks, and we assume this complex financial machinery is the product of our advanced industrial age. We think of the economy as something secular, cold, and mathematical, a machine built by economists and bankers over the last few hundred years. But we are wrong. The machine wasn't built in New York, London, or Shanghai. It was built 5,000 years ago in the dust and heat of what is now southern Iraq. The first multinational corporation wasn't the East India Company or Standard Oil. It was the temple. And the first CEO wasn't a robber baron in a silk suit. He was a high priest in a linen robe, managing a balance sheet for a shareholder who never spoke, never died, and never forgave a debt. That shareholder was God. This is the story of how the ancient gods of Mesopotamia inadvertently created the most powerful and destructive force in human history: compound interest. It is a story of how a system designed to manage a harvest turned into a trap that enslaved millions, toppled empires, and established a financial blueprint that terrifyingly we are still following today. To understand why your money loses value, why global debt is unpaid, and why the economy feels like a treadmill you can never get off, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the mud brick city of Uruk, where the line between theology and economics was first blurred, and the seeds of our modern crisis were sown. Picture the city of Uruk in 3200 BC. It is the largest city in the world, a marvel of engineering rising from the desert plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, dominated by the massive ziggurat, a stepped pyramid reaching towards the heavens. The city is not just a home for people, it is an engine of production. But here is the secret that modern history books often gloss over. The ziggurat wasn't just a place of worship, it was a bank, it was a factory, it was the administrative center of the entire state. In the mindset of a Sumerian farmer, the city didn't belong to the king, it belonged to the patron god of the city. In Uruk, it was Anu and Inanna. The land you plowed was the god's land, the water you used was the god's water, and the surplus grain you harvested, that was the god's profit. The priests were merely the accountants managing the god's estate. This theological setup created the perfect environment for the birth of bureaucracy. To manage the god's massive wealth, thousands of acres of barley, herds of sheep, workshops full of weavers, the priests invented writing. The first written words in human history were not poetry, nor were they laws. They were receipts. They were ledger entries. 5 sheep received from shepherd Urananch. But simply storing wealth wasn't enough. The temples were overflowing with grain and silver, and sitting on capital is bad business, even for a god. So, the priests began to lend it out, and in doing so, they stumbled upon a concept that would change the world forever. They invented the concept of interest. It didn't start as a predatory scheme. It started as a reflection of nature. In the ancient Sumerian language, the word for interest was mash. The literal translation of mash is calf, as in a baby cow. The logic was undeniable. If a farmer borrowed a herd of 10 cows from the temple to plow his fields and kept them for a year, those cows would naturally reproduce. By the end of the year, the herd would be larger. It was only fair that when the farmer returned the cows to the temple, he returned the original 10 plus the new calves. The interest was the natural offspring of the capital. It was biological. It made sense. The same logic applied to grain. If you borrowed a sack of barley seeds, you planted them, and nature multiplied them into 30 sacks of harvest. Returning a little extra to the lender was just sharing the bounty of nature. But then, a fatal shift occurred. The economy became more complex. Merchants needed something more durable than cows or barley to trade with distant lands. They needed a standard of value. They turned to silver. The temples began lending out silver, but they kept the old agricultural rules. They demanded mash, intrastan, the silver, just as they did on the cows. But there was a fundamental problem, a flaw in the code that would eventually crash the system. Cows have calves, grain grows, silver does not. Silver is sterile. If you lock a bar of silver in a chest, it does not breed, it does not multiply, it is dead matter. Yet, the temple bankers set the interest rate for silver at a staggering 20%, 1/5 of the principal, due every year. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. They had applied the laws of biology to the laws of mathematics. Biology has limits. Trees stop growing, cows die, but mathematics is infinite. Compound interest on sterile money grows exponentially, forever, without limit. In the early years, This wasn't an immediate disaster. The economy was booming, and trade was expanding. But exponential growth is deceptive. It starts slow, almost unnoticeable, like a lily pad doubling on a pond. For a long time, it seems manageable, and then, suddenly, it consumes everything. As generations passed, the math began to outpace the reality. A farmer would borrow silver to buy tools or seeds, promising to pay it back after the harvest. But nature is unpredictable. A drought would hit, a flood would come, the harvest would fail. In a biological system, if the crop dies, the debt should die, because the means of payment is gone. But in the financial system of the silver standard, the debt remained, and not only did it remain, it grew. The farmer couldn't pay the principal, so the 20% interest was added to the debt. Next year, he owed interest on the new total. The debt burden grew heavier, compounding year after year, turning into a mathematical monster that no amount of hard work could satisfy. The temples, acting as the creditors of the gods, were ruthless. A debt to the temple was a debt to the divine. You couldn't just default on Enlil or Marduk. The social contract began to warp. The farmers, the backbone of the civilization, found themselves in a hole they couldn't climb out of. They had lost their silver. They had lost their grain. Now, they had to offer the only assets they had left. First, they pledged their land. The temples and the wealthy elites who acted as intermediaries absorbed small family farms into massive corporate estates. The once free farmers were reduced to tenant sharecroppers on land their grandfathers had owned. But often, the land wasn't enough to cover the compounding interest. So, the farmers had to pledge something more precious. They pledged their freedom. This was the birth of debt peonage. It became a terrifyingly common sight in Mesopotamia to see a man dragging his own wife and children to the temple or the merchantess' house to hand them over as slaves. He wasn't selling them. He was servicing the debt. They would work in the creditor's household grinding grain, weaving cloth, doing hard labor for 3 years, 5 years, or sometimes forever, just to pay off the interest on a loan that had started as a small bag of silver. The society began to bifurcate. On one side, a tiny elite of creditors, temple bureaucrats, and palace officials who controlled the capital and the ledger books. On the other side, a growing mass of dispossessed, landless, and hopeless laborers who had lost their liberty to the mathematics of the gods. By 2400 BC, the crisis had reached a breaking point. The city-states were weakening from within. When a foreign army attacked, the kings faced a nightmare scenario. They would call for a levy of troops, but there were no free men left to fight. The citizens were all debt slaves working for the creditors. A slave has no country, and a slave has no reason to fight for a king who allowed him to be enslaved. The economic empire of the gods had become a parasite that was killing its host. The ledger books were full, the temples were rich, the math was perfect, but the society was collapsing. The ancient kings realized they were staring into the abyss. They had to make a choice: protect the sanctity of the debt contracts, or save their civilization from total annihilation. What happened next was one of the most remarkable and misunderstood events in economic history. A mechanism so radical that modern bankers would call it heresy, yet so necessary that civilization couldn't survive without it. The solution to the crisis wasn't a bailout. It wasn't a lower interest rate. It was a hard reset. Around 2400 BC, a king named Enmetena of Lagash did something that would send shivers down the spine of any modern banker. He issued a royal decree. He ordered his scribes to gather the clay tablets, the binding legal contracts that held thousands of his citizens in crushing debt, and he ordered them to be smashed. With that single act, the debts evaporated. The slate was wiped clean. This was the birth of the concept of the Jubilee. In the ancient Sumerian language, the word they used for this act was It is the first written word for freedom known to human history, but it didn't mean freedom in the abstract political sense we use today. It translated literally as return to mother. It was a specific legal description. The child who had been forced into slavery to pay off a father's debt was allowed to go home to his mother. The family farm that had been seized by the temple was returned to its original owners. The social order was restored. For the next 2000 years, this became the standard operating procedure in the Near East. Whenever a new king took the throne, or whenever social tension reached a boiling point, he would proclaim a clean slate. These ancient rulers understood a fundamental truth that our modern economists have forgotten: that mathematics is an abstraction, but society is a physical reality. When the exponential math of compound interest threatens to destroy the physical reality of the kingdom, The math must yield. The creditors, the wealthy merchants and temple bureaucrats grumbled. Of course, they lost their assets, but they accepted it. They understood that without these periodic resets, the entire economy would implode, and there would be no kingdom left for them to be rich in. The clean slate was the safety valve of the ancient world. It prevented the economic empire of the gods from becoming a suicide machine. But then, the story takes a dark turn. The safety valve was removed. As power shifted from the fertile river valleys of the east to the iron-willed legions of the west, the philosophy of debt changed. The rise of Rome marked the end of the Jubilee. The Romans were a society built on property and law, not on divine balance. In Roman law, a contract was sacred. If you owed money, that debt was more real than your freedom, more real than your life. The Romans stopped smashing the tablets. Instead, they smashed the debtors. They developed harsh laws that protected the creditor at all costs. If you couldn't pay, the law didn't save you, it crushed you. This shift in morality was profound and permanent. In Babylon, if a farmer couldn't pay because of a bad harvest, it was seen as a misfortune, an act of God that required mercy. In Rome, and later in our modern world, if you couldn't pay, it was seen as a moral failure. You were the sinner. The creditor was the saint. We are still living in the shadow of Rome. We have inherited their laws, their rigidity, and their refusal to look at the math. Fast forward 5,000 years to today. Look at the world around you. We have traded the clay tablets for digital servers, and the Temple of Marduk for the Federal Reserve and the IMF. But if you look closely at the engine under the hood, the mechanics are exactly the same as they were in ancient Uruk. We live in a world where the vast majority of money in circulation is created exactly like it was in Mesopotamia. It is created as debt. Every time a bank issues a mortgage or a student loan, it creates money out of thin air, but it demands that money back with interest. Just like the silver of the temples, this digital money is sterile. It doesn't breed. To pay off the interest, we must work, produce, and extract more from the earth, running on a treadmill that speeds up every single year to keep pace with the exponential math of the debt. Consider the modern university graduate. At 18 years old, before they have produced a single thing of value, they sign a digital tablet promising to pay tens of thousands of dollars. They are effectively entering a form of modern debt peonage. They haven't sold their bodies to a temple, but they have sold their future time, their stress, and their labor to a financial system that demands to be fed. The data is terrifying. Global debt has now surpassed $300 trillion. That is more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy. We effectively owe 3 planets' worth of output. To whom do we owe it? To the modern gods of finance, the pension funds, the central banks, the bond markets. We are working harder than ever, producing more than ever, yet we are drowning in red ink because we are trying to pay off exponential interest with linear growth. But unlike the Sumerians, we have forgotten the clean slate. We have convinced ourselves that if we just impose enough austerity, if we just work a little harder, the math will work out. But history is screaming a warning at us. The math never works out. There are 3 critical takeaways from the ruins of Mesopotamia that we ignore at our peril. First, debt is not a law of nature. It is a social construct. The ancient kings knew that the economy was meant to serve society, not the other way around. When we elevate the sanctity of debt contracts above the well-being of human beings, we create a brittle system that is destined to snap. Second, the conflict between the physical world and financial math is eternal. Biology grows in an S-curve. It eventually plateaus. A tree stops growing. A population stabilizes. But compound interest grows exponentially forever. When you try to force the physical world to keep up with exponential financial demands, the result is environmental destruction and social exhaustion. We are stripping the planet just to pay the interest on our loans. Third, and most important, is the lesson of the end game. History shows us that debt crises of this magnitude never end with everyone simply paying back what they owe. That is mathematically impossible. They end in one of 2 ways, either a controlled, orderly reset, like the clean slate, or a chaotic, violent collapse where the system burns down. There is no third option. The Mesopotamian gods built an empire on the idea that debt was a tool of control, but even they knew when to let go. We have built a machine far more complex, far more pervasive, and far more unforgiving. We have removed the humans from the equation and left only the math. So, the next time you look at the national debt clock spinning wildly out of control, or look at your own credit card statement, remember the farmers of Uruk. We are walking the same path they walked 5,000 years ago. The only difference is, they had a king who was brave enough to smash the tablets. We are still waiting for ours. The story of the economic empire of the gods didn't end in the sands of Uruk. We are living in its final chapter right now. And the scary part isn't the debt itself. The scary part is that we have forgotten that we have the power to forgive it. If you want to understand the hidden history of money that they didn't teach you in school, and if you want to be prepared for when the math finally breaks, make sure you are subscribed. The past is a mirror, and right now, the reflection is showing us exactly what comes next.